to History Inside a Nutshell, the show where we sail into our port of call discussing maritime history. In today's video, or interview, I invited historian Jake Billingham of Titanic Connections to retell the story of a stoker who survived 4 shipwrecks and collisions. But towards the end of his life, he was named Jonah because of his ill luck with disasters. His life was mysterious too, but it is now one that won't be forgotten. This is the story of Arthur John Priest, the Unsinkable Stoker. So today we are going to be doing something a little bit different on the channel because we've got my friend Jake with us. Jake, hello!
Hello!
Now, this is the first time you have come onto the History channel before, but
Yes.
but this is not the first time that you have actually talked about something before as well, like a history topic. Because I know on my main channel you talked about the history of the Titanic
Yep.
for my documentary, but well, this is going to be exciting, this interview, because we are going to be talking about one of your favourite historical figures, not just in the Titanic community, but of all time as well. Can you tell us who it is?
Yeah, it's a guy called Mr. Arthur John Priest, who was known as the Unsinkable Stoker. At least that's the legend of him. That's what's followed. The legend of him is the Unsinkable Stoker, and for good reason, which we will go into.
Definitely looking forward to that because I always wondered, and my parents also wondered as well, because we were sitting at the dinner table and
Hmm.
my dad asked me, why was he called the Unsinkable Stoker? And I said, Dad, I have absolutely no idea. But we have to get on to like Arthur, because when I did some research on him, I was
Hmm.
blown away by all the things that have happened. Because I actually first came across Arthur in a sketch called Stupid Deaths, which is on Horrible Histories and
I know. Yeah, I've seen that too.
but
Yeah.
I'm so disappointed and angry because they didn't really do him much justice. And I thought, I know
No,
it's a 25 minutes kids show, but seriously, come on, Horrible
there
History.
is so
You got
much
to
to
do
tell.
better than that.
Yeah, definitely.
But then when I went deep into further research, especially one blog post I came across, which I will leave in the description box down
Mm.
below, I was completely blown away. And I didn't even realize how much depth someone went into in his story. And I thought, do you know what? I know Jake wanted to talk about this for such a long time, so I
Yeah.
thought now's the time to do it.
Yeah, he was an incredible man. I mean, I actually came across him by chance through the BBC, but they made a few claims about him that wasn't exactly the ultimate truth. A lot of Arthur is sort of fabricated. One particular incident that apparently he was involved with, he wasn't involved with. In fact, the incident didn't even happen, which I will go into. Uh, but yeah, Arthur's story is, because it's not well known, and there are a lot of stories, because you see, Arthur never really spoke about any of his adventures or his life, really, um, which is unfortunate, because there would be a lot more about him than what there is. So, lucky enough, I've managed to come into contact with his family, his descendants, and they know a little, not too much, but they know a little bit about him, which has helped, with filling in the gaps with Arthur. But yeah, there is a lot of gaps in Arthur's story in his life. So he never really spoke. And if he did, there's no document that's ever been discovered. If he did write about it, but nothing's ever been uncovered of whether he did or not. But yeah, so there you go.
Well, that definitely sounds like it's a bit of a mystery, though. But the things that he did put down, and we do know about, not just
Yeah.
through like evidence, but through his family, his story was a bit more like into depth really, and even though you don't get some bits of like the
Mm.
stuff, there is layers on the cake that we do know that have been cut, and
Yeah.
we do know what's there to know about Arthur. And I thought that his beginning story was really interesting, especially since his early life, because his interest in working in at sea before he became a stoker was pretty
Mm.
engaging.
Yeah. I mean, Arthur's father was a labourer. He was born in Oxfordshire. His name was Harry Priest. And his mother, I think she was just a stay-at-home mother. She wasn't, which was Elizabeth. Her name was Elizabeth Gardner, or Nee Priest when she married Harry. Um, but they moved around a little bit. They went on to have 12 children altogether, and that's including Arthur. They moved around a bit around England. They moved around Warwickshire, Wales, Essex, and then they finally laid down roots in Southampton. Um, and in 1886, but a year before Arthur was born. Arthur was born on the 31st of August, 1887. Uh, yeah, he doesn't. I mean, the first time he ever comes up on census was he was living at 27 uh, Canal Walk, I think, in Southampton, and then that's when he must have been a couple of years old at the time. Obviously, they were a very poor family, and that's why Arthur probably went out to sea, because realistically, that's usually the route they would have gone. Um, they would have gone out to sea, because that's where really the money was with the shipping companies. Um, but yeah, so he signed upon the his first ship was the Astorius, which was in 1908, and he signed up as a stoker. The Astorius didn't sink. He didn't. There was no first impact or anything. The Astorius went on actually to become a hospital ship during the First World War, so she didn't sink. There's a lot of claims out there that she sank on a maiden voyage, or at least she collided with something and then sank on a maiden voyage. That didn't happen. I don't know where that report came from. Don't know where the story even originates, but there was no sinking of the Astorius, at least when Arthur was involved. But the Astorius went on to become a hospital ship during the First World War, and she was torpedoed during the First World War, but she didn't sink. They managed to beach the ship and managed to refloat it. And then she went on and got scrapped in 1933. So there was no first brush of disaster then. It was only when Arthur went on to work on the Olympic with the White Star Line, and he was expected to get a £6 monthly wage from working as a stoker on board the Olympic, which in those days was quite a bit of money. You know, this is where the money was. And then in September 1911, the Olympic collided with another ship, the battle cruiser, the Hawk, just off the coast of Isle of Wight. And the Olympic didn't sink, and Arthur managed to get off safely. And he was on the Olympic with another person who would go on to have another connection with him, Violet Jessop.
Of course, the
Of
famous
course,
Violet
Miss
Jessop.
Violet, yes. The Olympic was at fault, or at least that's what the Admiralty found, that she was at fault. Apparently that she drew the Hawk into her wake, and they came parallel together, and the Hawk struck the Olympic. And the Hawk was almost lost during that. She crushed her bow completely. Now, this is a ship that was supposed to be built with a bow that was designed to ram ships. and yet her bow was almost crushed when she collided with the Olympic and was almost lost. They managed to save her, and they rebuilt her with another bow. But the Olympic she managed to go back to Harlem the Wolf under her own steam. She'd flooded 2 compartments, but she didn't sink. And this is what would later go on to add weight to the unsinkability of the 3 Olympic liners, the Titanic and the Britannic, especially the Titanic. Because obviously, if the Olympic didn't sink after colliding with a ship, then, of course, they're going to be, that proves that they are safe, that nothing can take them down, not even ramming a ship. Obviously, that wasn't the case, obviously, because what would happen later on. Yeah, so yes, that was his actual first brush with disaster, or near as disaster.
Because I know that his first brush of disaster was the Titanic.
His first real brush with disaster, where the ship actually did sink, which was the Titanic. He signed up on the Titanic around the 6th of April, 1912. And he actually was on board the Titanic with another Titanic victim called Joseph Dawson, which people would think that would be Jack Dawson from Titanic, but it isn't. It's a guy called Joseph Dawson, who was a stoker, and actually Joseph was in a relationship, or at least was reported to be in a relationship with Arthur's sister, or one of Arthur's sisters. Yes. Yeah, they knew each other. In fact, Joseph Dawson gave his last address at Arthur's mother's house. He was living with Elizabeth, Arthur's mother.
Wow.
Yeah, Joseph. And I'm guessing they probably would have signed on to the Titanic around the same time and probably would have boarded together, because they would have clearly known each other, with him having the family connection, with the relationship between her and between him and the sister, Arthur's sister. We believe it was Nellie. She was known as Nellie, Nellie Priest. Now, we think it was her who was in the relationship with Joseph. Anyway, so Arthur, I believe from what Arthur's great niece has told me, is that I think his brother was supposed to be on the Titanic, but no, I don't think he ever managed to get on board, or was ever. We don't think so, because he's not under the crew list. So for some reason or another, he probably didn't get on board. But I believe he did end up. I think it was his brother George, who was on the Olympic with Arthur when she collided with the Hawk, and I think it was George who was supposed to be on the Titanic, but he didn't go. Which possibly could have probably saved his life. Life as a stoker was really difficult. I mean, really difficult. It was one of the hardest jobs you could ever have on board a ship. It was hot, dirty, and you would expected to work long hours in those conditions. It was as if it was like being shoved in an oven on a daily basis for hours on end. It was hot. I mean, you got 29 boilers going. It's a big ship. And 24, because obviously the Titanic didn't actually have all her boilers lit during the voyage. So 24 of the 29 boilers were lit.
Speaking of like the boilers, I know for a fact that I made contact with a Titanic descendant of a survivor, Julie, who is a descendant of Albert Cardwell, and
I know, Julie.
Yeah, and according to her, she told me in an interview that Albert actually went down into the stoker room, and she kind of like took pictures of the stokers on his camera, and they had like a little selfie moment.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
but unfortunately, Albert's camera was lost during the sinking, and Juliet always said as a joke that if someone actually goes down to the wreck and find a few artifacts, including the camera, that would
I
be
that
such
would
an
be great.
achievement.
That would have been an amazing photograph. I think there is maybe one photograph of Titanic stokers, firemen working on board ship. It might be wrong. It could be the Olympic, but I know there is a photograph very very similar to that. But anyway, so yeah, it was just a horrible job to do, but they had to do it because that was their wage, really. It was their living, and it was just in a lot of the cases they'd have soot stuck to their skin and it would burn them. It was hot in the bows of the ship, especially when the Titanic struck the iceberg. For Arthur to survive, because many of the crew, especially in the boiler rooms, didn't make it out. To manage to be able to survive in the bows of because it was harder to get up to the decks than it would have been for, say, third class, because they were in the bows, in the real bows of the ship, and they would have seen the first sort of seriousness of the situation. They would have seen it, and I don't know whether Arthur did. But I don't know where he was at the time. There is no indication of where he was. We don't know whether he was working in the boiler rooms at the time or he was not on duty. So there's no indication of where he was. But we know that for Arthur to survive those in the bows of the ships was just miraculous, because a lot of them didn't. A lot of them didn't make out, including Joseph Dawson, who didn't. The person that he boarded the Titanic with, expected to probably get home with, so that Joseph could probably end up marrying his sister, didn't make it off, which is sad. It really is sad. Now, we don't know how Arthur got off the Titanic, but there is a report later on. I think it was after the fourth sinking he was involved with. And there was a report where a reporter said that there was a guy, I don't know I can't remember if he mentioned him by name. So I actually have a copy of the report that a guy, Arthur, I think they did mention him by name. I'm trying to remember what it said off by heart. And I remember it saying that he suffered with frostbite to the toes. I think he lost a few toes due to frostbite. And yeah, so so at some point he came in contact with the cold water, the ocean itself. So it could be an indication that he may have managed to survive by getting on one of the collapsibles, when the ship took its final plunge. Some reports have him in lifeboat 15, but we don't know. I don't think so. I think I remember talking to Don Lynch about it couple of months ago, maybe a year ago, and he said that it's not. Well, we don't think it's lifeboat 15. So at some point he came into contact with the ocean because he had frostbite from the cold sea. So yeah, that was his survival of the Titanic. He never really spoke about the Titanic. He never took part in any of the inquiries of the sinking. But what we do know is that after the Titanic went down, most of the crew lost a lot of pay. They had their pay cut because they had no ship anymore. Technically, they'd docked, in a sense, I suppose, because the ship had gone down, and obviously they weren't working anymore. So they had no ship, they had no job. So they had the pay cut, which was a big deal for people like Arthur, especially if they've got families at home. But yeah, it was a difficult situation. I'm sure Arthur probably suffered with PTSD, but I think it's just the old British stiff upper lip, the old just get on, get on with it, because he didn't stop there, did he? Because he
No.
managed to go on other ships. So he just went back to sea.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a brave, brave man. I can never do that, really. I would get a shell shock from that, really. But
I would, yeah.
and then although he went onto the Titanic, he went onto a battleship next, didn't he?
Yeah, he seemed to have had a break between the Titanic and when he boarded the HMS Alcantara. The Alcantara was actually, she wasn't a battleship. She was actually a ocean liner that was launched in 1913. That was converted into a battle cruiser. So he was working on board her, and on the 29th of February 1916, she came into contact with a merchant raider, German merchant raider called the Grief. I believe that's what the ship's name was. I mean, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing that right, but it was the Grief, and they came into contact around 200 yards, and 2,000 yards between each other, and the Grief um, trained its guns onto the Alcantara and started firing at the Alcantara. And then she came closer, around 750 yards, and then carried on firing and struck the Alcantara's um, the watertight compartments and the hull itself. And anyway, during the battle, during the gunfire, the Alcantara's lifeboats had been smashed. So, even miraculously, for Arthur, who again signed up as a stoker on board the Alcantara, managed to survive after the ship capsized. She rolled over and capsized with the loss of 29. I think it was 29 crew. I might be wrong, but yeah. And when the ship had sank, the Alcantara, two ships called the Antus, and I think that's the ship's name, and the Cumus fired upon the Grief and sank that. And there was a big explosion. I think the ship managed to the guns managed to strike the Grief's ammunition barracks on board the ship, and an explosion took place, and the ship just sank. So that was the end of another survival. But again, Arthur never spoke about surviving the Alcantara. I'm guessing, the Cumus and other ships around the time would have picked the survivors up from the Alcantara. But yeah, again, another ship he never spoke about. And I think this is where Arthur's story sort of doesn't get forgotten, but it's not told as much, is because he didn't speak about it. Not like those people that were more vocal about their survival of these shipwrecks, such as, Margaret Brown and Violet Jessop and all the other ones, and Edith Russell and all those other people that survived the shipwrecks. And then Arthur never spoke, which is sad, because if he had, we might have got a bit more information, and I guess he just never really saw it as a big deal, just got on with it. But there you go, that's another brush with disaster.
Well, he definitely sounds like he was a very private person, though, to be fair, the trauma must have really, really affected his mental health as well as having PTSD. I can imagine that, really, hearing about, like, with two disasters. And
Mm,
I don't blame him, because you just feel like, you feel like if he didn't want to talk about it, then
yeah,
it's just a bit too traumatizing. And again, like you said, Jake, it is a shame, but it is understandable, because
yeah,
if I was that person, I would have done the same thing.
yeah. I mean, before the Alcantara, I forgot to mention that he got married to a lady called Annie. In 1915, they got married. Actually, have their birth certificate, and they were married on it. I actually, sorry, not that. birth certificate, the marriage certificate, and they were married on Arthur's birthday, the 31st of August, 1915.
Wow.
She was Annie Hampton at the time, I believe, and they got married in Liverpool, Birkenhead, and they went on to have children as well, which is great. You know, at least we've got Arthur's descendants, because if they hadn't had any children, but yeah, so that was amazing. And then he went from getting married to then being on another ship that was sank, but that he managed to survive.
And
He
of
went
course,
from a
it is
happy moment to a complete nightmare again. So yeah,
yeah, and of course it's the Britannic as well. But again, it's really, really surprising because you've got to think with the Britannic, she entered in the First World War, not
yeah,
having gone on a maiden voyage because of the war effort. But
mhm.
then something happens and she just sank. But did we know
Yeah.
what happened, what Arthur did when the Britannic sank after she struck a mine?
Again, he signed up as a stoker, uh, as he did with the other ships. Um, there isn't really any. Again, it's we still don't know. Um, Now, a recent animation done by a company, I believe it's Honor and Glory,
Oh
had
yes.
him. The real time animation had him in lifeboat number 4 with Violet Jessop. Now, I don't know whether that's the case because, again, there's no testimony or reports of Arthur being in that boat. I don't know whether it got mixed up with another Titanic survivor, Archie Jewell. When the mine struck, we don't know whether he was in bed or he was in the boiler rooms at the time when the mine struck. Um, but we know he survived. Again, the lifeboat situation. Now, Archie Jewell was in a lifeboat that was caught up in the propeller. Now, this is where I think it was a kind of a mix-up because um, Archie Jewell did write a letter to his sister how he survived the Britannic, and went into so much detail of how he survived. So I don't know whether those two got mixed up between Archie and Arthur with the animation, because again, there is no report of how Arthur got off the Britannic. Um, he was also on board the Britannic with his brother, Harry Priest, who was working as a fireman on board the ship. And both of them survived, managed to get off completely safe. And the Britannic sank in 55 minutes, which was a lot quicker than the Titanic. Again, another miraculous survival.
Wow.
Another, and for him to be in the boiler rooms again below decks to manage to survive. Again, it's crazy. It's he was unlucky, but lucky at the same time.
Mm.
Because although he did end up on these sinking ships, he survived.
Mm.
So he was kind of unlucky, but lucky at the same time.
And now we've got to talk about Arthur's last brush with disaster. And this was something that I was really shocked about because I have heard of how Archie Jewell, who you mentioned earlier, Jake, how he
Mm.
died on that one. But I was so really shocked, really, that Arthur actually survived this one about seventh time or sixth time lucky in that one. It depends if you count the Olympic or the Asturias as well. But what
Yeah.
happened on the Donegal?
Well, she was sailing through the English Channel when US 21, a U-boat US 21, or was it UC 21? Sorry, which came into it spotted the ship, and she fired torpedoes at it. It was a hospital ship, and it was sailing as a hospital ship. Now, for some reason, before there was an agreement between both sides of the war that they wouldn't fire on a hospital ship. If a ship is designated as a hospital ship and it was flying the hospital colours, and the hospital colours were international as well. So both sides used those colours, those markings. But for some reason, between that time and 1917, they started firing upon hospital ships. Now, it could be that the Germans thought that the British were using hospital ships to put munitions on them, contraband. I mean, even Britannic became sort of controversial towards the end between Germany and Britain, that they thought that they were using the Britannic for that purpose. So anyway, so the UC-21 fired upon the Donegal, and on board there was Arthur John Priest, who again was working as a stoker on board, and Archie Jewell, who was one of Titanic's 6 lookouts, who wasn't the guy that spotted the iceberg, but he could have been if he stayed on duty a little bit longer. Maybe 40 minutes later, he would have seen the iceberg. And then Archie Jewell went on to survive the Britannic. And then, sadly, when the when the Donegal sank, he didn't make it off when she was torpedoed in the English Channel. And Arthur did. 29 of the wounded soldiers that were on board died on board, and 12 of her crew. Arthur John Priest was injured during the sinking, a lot more badly than the Titanic and the Britannic and the Alcantara. He couldn't work anymore. He couldn't go back to sea anymore. His injuries, he'd suffered a severe head injury during the sinking, and he couldn't work anymore. It was either that, but later on, it was said that people wouldn't sail with him. Crew wouldn't sail with him. Clearly, Arthur must have mentioned the other incidences that, the accidents he was in with the Britannic and the Titanic and the other ships he was involved with. He must have mentioned it, because no one would sail with him. Crew would refuse to sail with him because of his bad luck with the sinkings. I mean, he had good luck because he survived, but not good luck for the rest who didn't. So Arthur suffered with a head injury, and then people called him Jonah. People wouldn't sail with him. So for the rest of his life, he stayed on land, and he started a family with his first son was born in 1917, but the child didn't survive beyond infancy. The child died in 1920, which was, awful. And then he had 2 more children. One was born in 1921, I believe, and the other one was born in 1919. So they were very close together in age. The family still owned the sympathy card for his son. I believe his great niece has it. Every time that either a child or a relative would pass away, you'd get a card from, either a funeral home or something. And they still own that. They still have that when his son passed away. We don't know how his son passed away, but yeah, he didn't survive infancy. From what I've heard is that during his time on land, is that he would regale his stories in bars about the sinkings, the ships. And then he eventually, his mother passed away. Elizabeth died in 1936, so only 2 years before Arthur. A year before Arthur, sorry. And 1935, so 2 years before. And she died, and he basically, from what I've heard, is that he had a job. He worked in refrigeration systems, and eventually he caught pneumonia. From what the family told me, is that he caught the flu, and he'd gone back to work too early, and obviously working in refrigeration systems, it's cold. and he died of pneumonia on the 11th of February 1937, at the age of 49, with his family and his wife around him. And he was buried in Hollybrook Cemetery. A lot of people, well, there was a report that he was buried in Devon, but it wasn't. He was buried in Hollybrook Cemetery. He is currently in an unmarked grave, and I've been working particularly with a guy called Trevor Baxter, who, bless him, has done a fantastic job with not only researching, but also he has worked tirelessly to try and get Arthur a stone. That's what Trevor Baxter does for the British Titanic Society. He does a lot of grave marking and, locating graves that had something to do with either Titanic, Britannic, Lusitania. And he does an amazing job. So great big shout out to Trevor Baxter, because he has filled in some of the gaps in Arthur's life. And so I've been working with him, and he's been keeping me in the loop to try and get Arthur a headstone. Arthur's wife, after Arthur's death, she went and married his brother.
Really?
Yeah, she after Arthur's death, she married his brother Albert Priest, and well, we don't know what happened with that marriage. I don't know whether it lasted long or he died. I don't know. But after that, she went and married a guy called Robert Polly.
Oh, how funny name.
Robert Polly. And I don't know what happened with the marriage, but they were obviously deeply in love, because after Robert died, and when Annie died, eventually in 1971, I believe she passed away. Ashes were scattered over her husband's then husband's grave, Roberts, and he was buried in St. Mary's Extra Cemetery. That's where, yeah. So it's tragic, isn't it? I believe it was her that was scattered. No, I believe she was buried and he was scattered, if I remember correctly. And then his sons went on. I mean, George, he was in the Second World War. He was a soldier during the Second World War. I think Frederick, his other son, was also in the Second World War. But they managed to survive the wars and later died. But yeah, it's crazy. But then after George, I think George died. George was the last one to be, and he died, I think, around 1997. Then it sort of went. The family went sort of, they don't know what happened. Went cold. And then recently, when we was working on the project to get Arthur a headstone, we managed to get into contact with some of the descendants. One was his granddaughter, Arthur's granddaughter, and the other one was Arthur's great niece. Sadly, though, as much as I've seen photographs of Arthur, and I've seen photographs specifically of his sisters and his sons, and also I saw, and there's a photograph out there of Annie too. But again, the family don't know much about Arthur, I'm afraid. I think the people that did or knew Arthur personally, because unfortunately, when Arthur died, his descendants now were not around. They weren't there. So they didn't know Arthur personally. So the people that did know him are now gone. And I don't think they ever really spoke about Arthur. Annie didn't. It could have been too painful for her, because obviously she must have loved Arthur very much. So it might have been just too painful for her to even speak about him, or even his experiences, and his son never really spoke about him, and neither did any of the grandchildren, or never really spoke about Arthur. So there are a few gaps in Arthur's life, and possibly will never be known, especially the survivals. But what we do know is from news reports and people not wanting to sail with him and things, and the injury that he suffered, because obviously there was a news report that mentioned the injuries. But the news report came out after the sinking of the Donegal, and I believe it was a report about the Donegal, and it reports that Arthur had suffered the head injury and the frostbite from the Titanic. But also it mentions the Astoria sinking and that he was on board the ship, which, again, I don't believe happened, because it didn't sink in 1908 and he wasn't on board the ship when it was a hospital ship. So when it sank, when it was torpedoed and refloated, he wasn't even on board the ship. So the report kind of fabricated on that one, but everything else rings true. The demeanor and the injuries and stuff. It's Arthur's story is, I think, because I know one of your questions is what makes him important. I think what makes him important is that there are short stories of Margaret Brown, who survived the Titanic, and she was later named Unsinkable. Then there's a lot of stories about Violet, and but the two main ones that don't get mentioned a lot, and that's Archie and Arthur, which is a shame. And I think part of that is because, especially with Arthur, because there wasn't so much spoke, he didn't really speak about the disasters, and we only have his records of him being on those ships. And there was also a medal. I have a certificate that was a medal that was awarded to Arthur for his service on the ships during the war. So there is those records and logbooks and everything with him being signed upon the ships, but we don't have any concrete stories of his survivals, of how he survived. So it's not as, I suppose, as gripping as Margaret Brown and Violet, who talk about how they survived, and they go into great detail. So there's that. Okay, we're hooked because we can actually hear them. We can read their stories. There's a book out for Violet. There's a voice recording, but there was none of that with Arthur. So I think his story just sort of faded with history, because there was not that much said about him or talked about. There's only really that one newspaper report that came into contact, but that was after the Donegal. But after that, there's nothing. Not even the family know a great deal about him. So it's this big mystery of him, and I think he's important because, like Violet, although he went through all these disasters, he still muscled on and went back to sea and just carried on. It's that British stiff upper lip, and I think that's what's important. He is important because that poor man, people might call him Jonah, and but he did survive, even though he was probably in many cases in a worse situation or circumstance than, say, third class, because he was in the bowels of the ship. So for him to survive, I mean, because Frederick Barrett, again, who is another well-known stoker, leading fireman on board the Titanic, again, his survival is more well-known because he did talk about it. He took part in the inquiries and things. He cemented his stories with talking. Well, Arthur didn't, so his survivals have just faded. But we have to remember that he was a stoker, and he his survival is more miraculous because he was in the bows of the ship. A lot more harder to get, especially when the ship started to fill up with water, because they were the first places to start filling up with water. So to be down there, and especially with it, I wouldn't say especially, but with the Alcantara being in a battle and actually being sunk in battle, again, is miraculous. Because it's more unpredictable because you don't know what's going to happen. Ships could sink or blow up like the Grief did. So for him to survive, and Arthur had a real tough life, really, to not only survive all these sinkings, but to lose his son at such a young age really must have affected him. Really must have affected him. It's sad, but we have to remember he is part of Titanic. He is part of the Britannic story. He was on them. In fact, he was on all three. And in the most especially for the Olympic and the Titanic and the Britannic, he was there when these incidents took place, when the most important in history these events took place. He was there. We have to remember is that he's just as important as any other passenger or crew that was on those ships. And Arthur, wow, he reminds me of a program, a TV show, comedy called Only Fools and Horses. You probably know.
Oh yeah,
Uncle
yeah.
Albert. Uncle Albert. It was for those people who live in America. You probably heard of it. You may not have done. But it's a program about a dodgy dealer called Derek Trotter from London, who gets into trouble quite a lot. and his uncle comes to live with them. And just like Arthur, he survived all these shipwrecks, just like Arthur did. And everybody thinks that's where the story comes from. Maybe the writer knew about him and maybe incorporated that, because it's very Arthur and Albert, very similar names, very close. I think that's where he got the idea from.
I think it's a really good idea, but my dad's going to be really pleased because he's a big fan of Only Fools and Horses. So.
Yeah, so I think there is that Titanic connection. And I think what we need to do now is to make sure that that man, Arthur John Priest, gets a headstone. Because for over 80 years, people have just walked by his grave and not know he's there. Because it's just grass. There's nothing to mark it. And I think it's important to get a stone on his grave because his story's incredible. And the man should be remembered and should be marked like anybody else should. So I know the British Titanic Society are working on it, but I think it's important we do that.
Yeah, definitely agree. I know that I actually visited Hollybrook Cemetery. Oh, when was this? Earlier this year, really, while I was filming the Titanic documentary, because I was trying my hardest to find Frederick Fleet's grave, that the British Titanic Society erected a headstone for, but I really couldn't find it anywhere because if you have been to the cemetery, there's this long big field because the church has a lot of land, and there are still bits of grass up there that were undiscovered or they were really downhill, so it
Yeah,
was impossible to find. But then I did come to see one Titanic grave,
yeah,
and I can't remember who it was, but I need to look back on the research again because I did get in contact with Thomas Linsky about it. But I definitely need to look back on it again. But it's just so over hard to look on everything because most of the graves at the cemetery were all Titanic survivors or victims, and you just got to think, even though it's the biggest cemetery, probably in Southampton, it has a lot of history where people are forgotten and just not remembered, or there are people who have been remembered. And
Yeah,
yeah,
I think it's difficult because I mean, with the Titanic, for instance, there was 2,000 people on that ship. I mean, I think it's difficult to remember every single one, but I think what helps is um, you've got so many people interested in the story, so you don't need one person to remember everybody that was on that ship. You just need a person to remember one particular, at least one particular person or a couple that were on that ship. And I think with Arthur, for me, he sticks out. And the reason why he is important to me is that I feel that connection with him. I mean, he died on the 11th of February 1937. Well, I was born on the 11th of February 1992. I feel that connection with him. So he is important to me. And I think I always make sure, as when people say, oh, Violet Jessel, I always make sure that Arthur is put there too. Because I'm like, okay, Violet's great. I love Violet. I can't not love Violet. But she survived 2 shipwrecks and 1 accident. Arthur survived no less than 4 shipwrecks. So, you know, I always make sure Arthur, even though his story wasn't told through him, I make sure that what I've been able to gather on him, or with the help of other people too, because Trevor has helped a great load, Trevor Baxter, in filling a lot of the gaps, um, is that we can make sure that his story is told through us, make sure that people are aware of him. I think he's becoming more known because he's getting more. I've seen a lot of people mention him, especially on Facebook. He does get the odd mention, and in fact, recently, RMS Titanic Inc. did a post about him. So he is becoming more known. We just need to keep remembering him. That's what's important, and that he's got more than one Titanic connection because of Joseph as well, Joseph Dawson. So yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. But I love Arthur. I love his story. I've become very close with his great niece. We've become very close friends. I ring her quite regularly, usually when she's doing something. She always tells me off. She's like, Jake, you always ring me when I'm doing something. I was like, sorry. um, yeah, but she's so sweet. The family is great. Yeah, his great niece is amazing. The fam. I've learned a little bit about Arthur from what they know or what they've been told, but it's not a great deal. But I don't mind. It doesn't matter to me. Just having that relationship with the great niece is fantastic, and it's not just because she's Arthur's great niece. It's because I treat them like because they're people. That's it. She's a friend, not just because of Arthur. But it's obviously Arthur that I've met the great Arthur's great niece. Um, and I think we always say I think Arthur's trying to get he's there. You've got to meet this person. He's there in the background. I think it's yeah. So I'm waiting for the day when the stone gets put on, because when the stone gets put on, I'm going down and I'm going to be there.
you're gonna have to tell me all about it really when it does come up. I'll definitely keep in the loop really. And I think if it does happen, we'll have to come back on and do another talk about it.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
mean, definitely. I really definitely want to talk about the stone when it's on. Um, it's not just Arthur though. But, I mean, there's lots out there that have not been marked, but Arthur. because he's been forgotten so much, that I think it's important to have his stone put on, so that, instead of for 80 odd years, people have walked by his grave and not known he's there. And it's nice for people to be able to walk by his grave and know he's there. The man was, he just kept bouncing back. Strong man. A lot of men these days could learn a lot from Arthur. A lot of people could learn a lot from Arthur. How you could just bounce back. It doesn't matter what life throws at you. Same with Violet. It doesn't matter what life throws at you. You can bounce back. Arthur lost a son who was on sinking ships. He lost a lot of friends on those ships, because he would have made friends. He'd have been close friends with these people. In some places, they might have even been neighbours, because he was from Southampton. He was born in Southampton. He was from Southampton. Most of the crew came from Southampton. I'm sure he lost a lot of friends on the Titanic and the Britannic and all those ships he was being on. He would have lost a lot of friends, and that's traumatic enough, especially, to lose his future brother-in-law Joseph, his potential brother-in-law Joseph, and then just to bounce back and to be able to go back to sea. It's not about him being a Jonah. What should be important is how he bounced back, how he got on when he just got back on those ships. It's like you fall off the horse, you get back on it.
That's a very, very good idiom, actually. I like that.
That's what he did.
Yeah, and it's definitely a really good idiom. I think I've fallen in love with Arthur already, really, but we need to talk about him in a future episode, really, and we need to do one of Archie Jewell as well. I would love to know more about Archie.
Definitely. Archie is just as amazing as Arthur. Sadly about Archie, though, his body was never recovered from the Donegal. So the only memorial he's got is actually in I think it's the Tower Memorial in I think it's Tower Memorial, the War Memorial in London. That's the only marking he's got. I believe his son and his wife, his child, had his name put on the headstone, but that's the only markings he's got. His body was never recovered. He was only 29 as well. So he was younger than me, a year younger than me.
It sounds like he was a year younger than I am, because I'm also 28, oddly enough. But yeah,
he's a year older than you, a year younger than me. I think, so I definitely would love to talk about Archie. The other one I'd like to talk about is Captain Bartlett too.
Yes.
Of course, you can't talk about Britannic without talking about Bartlett.
Yeah, and I know especially that he played a huge part in the Titanic inquiry as well as the sinking of the Britannic.
He did. He
definitely
did.
Come on, yeah.
Yeah, well, he was Bartlett. He was the superintendent of the White Star Line. So, yeah.
Oh goodness, but definitely have to talk about these gentlemen for another time. But we're going to wrap this up there. Jake, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to have you here, especially on the New History channel as well. So we'll definitely have to invite you back for future episodes. But it's been really great fun, and I've definitely learned a lot about Arthur. So
it's been fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to share Arthur's story.
Oh, anytime. Definitely, we've got to talk about more Titanic stories as well as Arthur. But let me know if that headstone gets on there. I'll be the first to know.
we're hoping. I think because sadly, COVID has slowed everything down. But I think they're trying to set up some fundraising for the stone, and not just Arthur's, but other stones as well. So I think that hopefully they'll get that up and running soon. But because of COVID, it slowed everything down, and I'm gathering, because obviously when the stone gets put on, it's going to get a lot of attention from media and stuff. So we've got to think about people crowding around the grave itself, with the pandemic and stuff. So we've got to make sure people are safe while we're commemorating this man, Arthur. So hopefully once, because now COVID's sort of starting to clear up a little bit and things are starting to slightly go back to normal. Hopefully it will happen soon. So cross our fingers.
Oh, fingers crossed, indeed, actually. But Jake, it was really great to have you, and yeah, we'll have to catch you up with very soon. And
Thank
until
you.
then, everybody, we'll catch you very soon as well.
Thank
But please
you.
make sure to like and subscribe, and yeah, and until then, we'll catch you for the next one. Take care,
Bye
bye.
bye.
If you enjoyed this week's episode, please subscribe for more historical content. Until next time, this has been History Inside a Nutshell, Departing from the Docks. Thank you so much for all of your support and enjoy the rest of your voyage.